Okay, I'm really excited to introduce our closing plenary session, which is a discussion among House and Senate staff on foreign aid and the implications for international development in this changing world. In our variety of breakouts and plenary sessions, we obviously heard quite a bit about the role, the oversight, the engagement of the Hill in development, but also in the concept of this growing intersection among the 3Ds. And so it's very, very exciting to have a panel focused specifically on this topic today. I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce Jorge Ingram as our moderator. George's professional career in Congress, the executive branch, and the nonprofit sector has focused on international economic and development policy. He is currently a senior fellow in the Global Economy Development Program at the Brookings Institute. He also serves as chair emeritus of the USGLC and as co-chair of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, MFAN. From 1998 to 2000, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator of Aid with primary responsibility for U.S. assistance programs in the former Soviet Union. Currently, he serves on the boards of the Eurasia Foundation, the Executive Council on Diplomacy, the Dockery Farm Foundation, and Friends of Publish What You Fund. So with no further ado, over to you, George. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We are privileged to have with us 3 senior congressional staff from the House and the Senate who work on a daily basis on things that we, the SID community, care about. To my left immediately is Joan Condon, who's the professional staff member and oversees foreign assistance and international peacekeeping at the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, a position I held one time. Next is Jim Walsh, who's legislative director for Congressman Ted Yoho, and then Josh Klein, who's a professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, focusing on development, energy, and the environment. We're going to have a conversation up here for 30, 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you to engage the panelists. And my first question is, we've had for a number of years a Congress which is somewhat dysfunctional, is partisan, has difficulty passing major pieces of legislation, but on the issue of foreign aid, there's been a high degree of bipartisanship. The last Congress passed 8 bills, all on a bipartisan basis on foreign aid. And so my question is twofold. What explains this high degree of bipartisanship on foreign assistance and development? And how do you see that playing out this year in significant legislation? In the appropriations bill, in the BUILD Act, which would strengthen the U.S. development finance capabilities, in food aid reform, and the reauthorization of the Global Security Act. Joan, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for having us here today. I think what may be driving some of the success on the development front is that we have some really good leadership, both on the Republican and Democratic side, who have made a conscious choice to act in a bipartisan manner. Nothing could get accomplished in this area if not for bipartisan leadership. And so that's really been a key to the success of a lot of these things. When you flagged that there have been 8, it strikes me that it's a lot. We make it look easier than it really is. It takes several years to get any of those pieces of legislation actually up and running and enact it, but I'm very proud of what we've been able to do. I think there's also a growing consensus that what's happening overseas really affects us at home, and I think that started with 9/11 and has continued to carry forward this as we're looking at these mass crises overseas. We understand more fully that poverty drives instability, and instability affects us at home. And so we have an interest in responding. We've also been getting better about making smart investments. Rather than throwing good money after bad solutions, we're being a lot smarter about it, and we're getting better at telling the story about why it matters and what we get in our return on investment. And so I think that's probably where I would start. In terms of the legislation, I'll let Jimmy talk about the BUILD Act, but on food aid, that's a bit more complicated because that's not a partisan issue. If you look at the way the votes have gone down for food aid reform, it's regional and it's sector specific. There is not a Republican-Democrat divide on food aid reform. I think most people recognize that there is both a moral and a strategic and a humanitarian imperative to stretch our $8 farther so we can feed as many people as quickly and efficiently as possible. The challenge is in addressing some of the parochial interests of some of the various sectors that benefit from the status quo. So that's going to continue to be a challenge. Unfortunately, that has not changed, but we're still working it, and I think we'll have some success on the Global Food Security Act this year.
You expect some progress this year?
I do expect some progress this year. The House Foreign Affairs Committee has already marked up the Global Food Security Act, and the Senate has marked their version as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing one of them on the floor almost as soon as we get back. And I think that they'll move. And we're looking for as long of an authorization period as possible.
Great. Jim?
You said it all. Really, all I had to add to that I've noticed, I mean, we've been at war for at least half of my lifetime, and we've seen the drain on our treasury, not just
bragging about how young you are.
and not just on the treasury, but on blood, resources, everything. And I think that there's been a consensus that everyone has come to that our foreign aid dollars, while very small, there is a disproportionate effect that they have, and we'd much rather prevent these than go trillions and trillions and trillions more into debt, kind of prolonging these wars, really.
Jim, let me push you a little further, because I think your boss, Congressman Yoho, is an example of how a member of Congress who's come to here, and he says, I came here against foreign aid, I got educated, I'm now supportive of it. What turned him around?
Short answer, me. Long answer, he came from North Florida. He is a large animal veterinarian, and all of our constituents, everyone, for years and years, they hear that, and I know everyone's aware of kind of the false stories out there that foreign aid is a gigantic portion of our budget, it's a waste of money, they always hear all these horror stories. But when he got up here, he got on the Agriculture Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, and first few hearings, he started kind of taking a deeper look, and he asked me to start bringing in people. So I started with Mrs. Littlefield when she was at OPIC. She came in, started talking to the boss, and he was astounded by the work that OPIC was doing. The next one, I kind of loaded the deck for him. I then brought in MCC, kind of the real kind of Republican winners are in his view that he would really like. And then just kind of started expanding on that, and he really started to get more educated on what's actually happening. And really that's the biggest thing, is getting these stories out from the DC bubble and out to the farms of Florida, of North Florida. And so we've constantly been putting in op-eds and going around the district and the state talking about how our investments overseas, and he always likes to talk about South Korea, how they actually impact the farmers at home who are now trading with South Korea. So it was really kind of just expanding on that stuff.
And just one other issue, you and your boss have been the principal authors on the BUILD Act to strengthen our development finance capabilities. How do you think that's going to contribute, and why is that so important?
Well, So I guess the basic answer is our development finance structure has not been significantly reformed since it was created in the 70s. Since then, our financial institutions have vastly changed, the world has changed, and we really need to keep up with that. But also, there are more DFIs out there that we need to be engaging with, and that can help, we can help work with them, which would catalyze even more change and even more kind of progress on the home front. And really it gets to what I was speaking earlier, how does the farmer in North Florida realize these benefits? My boss's mantra has always been, let's go from aid to trade. And that's really what we wanted to do. And so we looked at OPIC, hasn't been significantly reformed, and what are the other DFIs doing around the world? How can we work with them? And also earlier this Congress, he was named chairman of the subcommittee on Asia Pacific. So he got really into everything China's doing with One Belt, One Road, and they're pouring trillions of dollars into that. That's just hard currency. So what can we use as one of our greatest assets in America? That's our private sector. So let's capitalize on that and really get them into the game.
Josh, what accounts for the bipartisanship on this issue in the Senate, and what do you see coming up this year?
Yeah, so, I'll spare everyone the high school civic lesson, but, the Senate, the world's most creative, deliberative body, is where a lot of legislation goes to die. And so...
You sound like a House member now.
Well, it's true. I mean, because the process and the rules of the Senate and how slow legislation moves does not afford the Senate the opportunity to do much on bills just on a regular basis. I mean, we take up large bills, farm bill, transportation reauthorization, appropriations bills occasionally on an individual basis, National Defense Authorization Act. But when it comes to bills like the BUILD Act, it's not going to go to the floor for a vote. Chances are it'll have to be passed by unanimous consent, which means 100 votes. I mean, every senator has to you basically agree to let it go. And we see this on all bills. So that's why, when we, you mentioned 8 bills that we've done, I think about Power Africa, for example. I would put that in there. I don't know if that's part of your 8. But, it starts in the committee, in the Foreign Relations Committee, that has a long history of comedy where, we don't move anything that, the majority won't move anything that we don't agree to putting, or that the minority doesn't agree to put on the agenda. That doesn't mean we'll vote for it, but we at least have to have an agreement that this is that we are going to be taking this up and putting it on a markup agenda. I used to cover the Environment and Public Works Committee beat for Senator Condon. That is not how EPW works. I mean, when Barbara Boxer was chair, she rammed things through there against against Senator Inhofe and the Republicans that were in the minority then, and then when it flipped, it happened the exact opposite. So, but the Foreign Relations Committee does not function that way. It is a bipartisan. It functions on bipartisan agreement, and I also would attribute a lot of the bipartisanship on the committees that we've got some really great development champions in the Republican caucus as well as in the Democratic caucus that frequently work together. I look at Senator Young, Senator Rubio, Senator Flake. I mean, these are champions for development on the Republican side. And the majority, or the ratios on the committee are so slim, I mean, it's just 11 to 10, that all you need are, a few votes here, and if you've got a Democratic bill that you've got a few Republicans supporting, it can pass. If you've got a Republican bill that maybe some Republicans don't support, you'll likely have some Democrats support it on our side, and so you can pass bills out of committee with bipartisan support. But when it gets to the floor, that's the tricky part, right? Because, like I said, things have to pass on unanimous consent. And going back to the Power Africa model, we reported that bill out of committee, we were going to report it out of committee with an OPIC reauthorization. That was Title II of that bill. Right. It had to come out because there was not sufficient bipartisan support to pass that part of the bill. So that came out. And also, I'd note that Power Africa wasn't an authorization bill. There was no money associated with it. That also helps. And when you look at a lot of the bills that we've moved that deal with foreign aid, it's not changing the dollar amounts in authorization, it's changes in policy or just extending new programs. Keeping it simple, I think, has been critical to the success that we've had also. I look at, to talk a little bit about what Joan was mentioning about food aid reform in the Farm Bill, that's not a partisan issue, that's a regional issue specifically. And so it all will break down on, or come down to whose domestic interests there are, and it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're representing a coastal state with a huge port, you are going to feel a lot more pressure from the maritime industries on reform, or if you're a state that represents commodity growers, there's going to be pressure there, and it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, that's where the pressure comes from on those sort of issues. So, I think that as long as we keep things simple and that we can work together on things, I think the BUILD Act is something that we've seen a lot of engagement on, and things that are not being, hammered out in the dark, that really helps. I think that when bills emerge out of nowhere and no one's seen it except for, except for 24 hours before it's marked up, that doesn't breed trust on either side when it comes to advancing it. So the openness that the sponsors of the bill have had in listening to concerns, I think will serve the BUILD Act well.
Nice to hear that transparency works.
Yes, exactly. Why wouldn't, yes.
Second issue, and I'm going to start with you on this, Josh, is last week Publish What You Fund published a 4-country study, Cambodia, Liberia, Nicaragua, Senegal, on what the impact of the proposed specific cuts to those country aid programs from the FY19 request would have. And among the findings are that it would undercut U.S. objectives and risk instability. For example, with Liberia, the U.S. has been investing in building up government capacity and stabilizing the political environment, just as a new, inexperienced government takes office. In Senegal, the U.S. has been investing in agriculture in an area of historic and low-level but continued conflict. In Nicaragua, the U.S. is the sole donor to the independent sector, is the sole independent donor. All the other ones go through the government in building up civil society just at a time when civil society is under pressure. And we're seeing the same situation in Cambodia. What are your thoughts on this report and how it will be received on the Hill?
Well, I think that the breadth in which, I think that there's how it will be received on the Hill really depends on just how many people really look at these things, I think. I think that you'll have concerned offices that may look at it and point to it, but I think the reach that it has, it could come up as a point of discussion in, over the BUILD Act, but the opportunity to discuss something like this is very challenging. We've had, in the Foreign Relations Committee in particular, our hearing schedule has, this is something that I think that that Senator Menendez would want to push for having a hearing on, but it'd be very hard to get agreement on the terms for that. But I think that what this points to more is, or what the report points to is just how serious this budget is, or the budget proposals that we keep seeing from the administration. And I think that the question that needs to be asked of the administration by Congress and by stakeholders is, we need to see more realistic budgeting, budget proposals, because as you pointed to, the cuts and the impact that it could have, and the destabilizing effect that it could have, these are not things that I don't think are that need to be taken into greater consideration as the administration develops its budget. Because I think that there's way too, and I think that the fact that Congress and the appropriations process tends to save USAID or save our foreign assistance. And this sort of notion that Congress will always be there to save these programs is dangerous. And I think that is a message that I hope this report gets across, and that that to the extent that Publish What You Fund can push it out. I think it needs to be read. But I just, the thing about reports like this is that it always strikes me that they make a splash when they come out, but then it's the legs that reports have and the influence that it has over time. I think it's a challenge that the stakeholder community has in making sure that these types of findings have resonance, and finding forums to your question about how will this be received. I think it just has to do with how long it can be in front of us, and that's a marketing question. So
that's a question for the crowd here.
Yeah.
Jim?
Really, kind of just going off of Josh's point on time to read. So I work in a congressional personal office, not on committee, and we have a legislative staff, not including myself, of 3 others, handling every other issue. So these reports will come out, I'll read the summary, and try to get buried down into it when a hearing or something catches my eye that we need to really get into. But otherwise, I'm dealing with, on average, about 500 emails a day just in my issues, and then overseeing my legislative staff on everything. So really, the splash that it makes, I think it will only make really with members on the Foreign Affairs Committee and how much we talk about it to other members, like, hey, did you see this President's budget request? That makes a large splash, but again, it's not really useful. I mean, the power of the purse lies with Congress. Article 1, it's more of, this is kind of what the president is looking at, but we have the power of the purse strings. I do like that his recent budgets have really jump-started the conversations and gotten everybody to come up here engaging with members that aren't just on Foreign Affairs Committee. They're talking to members that have never even thought outside of, I don't know, their domestic issues or anything like that. They're coming up to my boss and talking about this stuff. So if there was one positive takeaway of the budget requests from the president, it's that it's really jump-starting the conversations, which I think is very beneficial. But yeah, that's really.
Jim, I can tell you always look for the positive element of something. You see the benefit of threats.
Sometimes.
Well,
Joan?
I think Publish What You Fund does an excellent job in kind of holding a mirror up to us so we understand actually what we are spending our money on. And again, when I spoke earlier about needing to be able to clearly articulate what's at stake and then the return on investment, those reports do that, in fact. But in terms of the impact on the budget discussions themselves, I mean, as Jim said, the Congress proposes, Congress disposes, and we've already roundly rejected the FY18 budget proposal. We've already roundly rejected the 19 proposal, I believe, but there are some good elements of the 19 proposal that don't really seem to resonate that I do want to highlight. And the first is that it's trying to get things back into the regular budget that should have been in the budget long ago. Mm-hmm. And so moving OCO back to regular budgeting, right, that's a really positive development, and that may be lost on a lot of people because it's a gimmick and so on, but it's actually rationalizing these programs, and so that's a very positive development, and the willingness of Congress to say, actually, we want to prioritize these investments and we're not going to use this budget gimmick to do it. I think that's a good thing. Also, again, since it's all about what I work on, the food aid reform proposal, the president has the right idea. The approach may not be as successful as one would hope. You can't seek to consolidate 2 multi-billion-dollar accounts and then slash them by, roughly 50%. So yes, you will get a great deal of efficiency if you can reform food aid, but not that much. So What we need to do in terms of talking about the budget and what might be relevant for you all is just a couple of do's and don'ts. I think the don't is don't panic. This is all a budget game. We all know it. Every president that I have been alive for has always undercut democracy and governance. Every president has always undercut humanitarian assistance. And they do that because they know Congress prioritizes those accounts. So they can put funds elsewhere that might not be a congressional priority and put all of their eggs in that basket and count on us to go ahead and make those accounts whole. Do be proactive. Do make sure you're telling the story about, as you did in these reports, what we are actually investing in and what that return is. Don't obsess just about a number. If you need a budget to have year-on-year increases indefinitely, it's probably not a good program. So you probably shouldn't focus strictly on the need to have numbers go up and up and up and up every year. Instead, focus on what we're getting from it. And when you see successes, tell the story. When you see challenges, tell the story. But really tell the story when you're seeing the successes. And then finally, do demonstrate a commitment to learning and adapting. Because we know that engaging in development is a risky business. And we want you to innovate. We want you to try new things. Don't keep doing the same old thing over and over again and expect a different result. Innovate, but adapt your learning. If you're going to fail, that's fine, but make sure that you then are able to take that learning and do it differently next time so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Good. Third issue, and again, I'll start with you, Joan, is we're seeing a lot of churning at AID. We're seeing Mark Green lead the agency through organizational and process changes. First, looking at those organizational restructurings of pulling together resilience, conflict, humanitarian assistance into one new big mega bureau, joining budget and policy, creating 2 new associate deputies, associate administrators. How is the Hill seeing this restructuring at AID?
I can speak only for myself and how I see it, but I actually...
Oh, I was supposed to make...
Yes.
I was supposed to say that these, at least the 2 on the end, Joan and Josh, are speaking for themselves, yes, not their committees.
Yes.
Jim, I think, can speak for Yoho.
Well, I think there's a missed opportunity with the whole redesign effort at the State Department. I think that was a bit disappointing, and perhaps now with the new Secretary of State, maybe that process will be reinvigorated, but it looks like that's really just going to be processes. USAID, I think, has taken the challenge more seriously and is really kind of thinking about not just what the org chart looks like, but what it actually provides. And so, you know, the devil's in the details. We still need to understand how this is going to play out on a day-to-day basis, but I like the idea of having 2 associate administrators. There are right now more than 25 direct reports to the administrator. That is way too many direct reports for an administrator. That actually hampers his ability to really project outwardly, both within the interagency and internationally. And so we need to kind of lift some of that burden from the administrator himself. At the same time, you have to have clear lines of authority and make sure that these new mega bureaus are fully empowered within the interagency process. You know, you're going to have a bureau head now talking to 3-star generals on stabilization. So you have to have the right person in that position with enough authority behind them to have those conversations. I like the idea of really bringing a concentrated focus on humanitarian assistance, and I like the idea of consolidating the policy, performance, and budgeting proposals, because you really need to know what, again, I keep saying it over and over again, but you need to understand what you're buying and what you're getting from it. So if you don't have your budgeting and policy aligned, then you've got serious problems. I think the real challenge moving forward is going to be what they do on staffing and procurement reform. We hear a lot of talk about they want to do better talent management. They need to be able to streamline hiring authorities, and they absolutely have to. They need to be able to attract talent when and where it's needed most, but they also need to let that talent move on when it's no longer needed. And that becomes very difficult, and it seems there's been a bit of a caste system that's come in place. There is a very important role for PSCs to play, but there are both positive and negative effects of having so many PSCs. There's a positive and negative effect of so many PASAs. That's the participating agency service agreements, so where you have someone from USDA working for USAID, which is a good thing if they're working on ag, not a good thing if they're being hired to do democracy programming, which has happened, because that is the designated hiring mechanism for one of the bureaus. And that's a problem. We really need to really think about how they can attract talent and how they can hire and fire people.
And just kind of building off of that, from the personal office standpoint, we've been really impressed with Administrator Green's engagement outside of just foreign affairs members. He came and spoke to the House Freedom Caucus. He's really reaching out and engaging everyone about just not only just this process, but everything else going on at USAID and really the benefits for the United States. So that's what we've been really tracking.
Yeah. So I think that the process by which the reforms have gone on is exactly how a process needs to be run. And the fact that the USAID has touted that particularly the reorganization, the structural changes of the agency have been staff-driven, which is what we want to hear. A lot of their presentations that they do for the Hill and with stakeholders have been done. There's Jim Richardson, who's always there, but a lot of the talking is being done by the career staff that have been involved in it, which I think is important because they should be the face of it. They should own it if they've been so involved in it. I also appreciated that the solicitation for comments from Congress on the proposal when they were finally done rolling out all the different elements of it. Senator Menendez submitted 8 pages of comments, and we are awaiting a response. But I think that, I lived and breathed that month of getting briefed on it and had been engaged on it before that. But when I finally saw it on paper, there were some things that jumped out at me that I have, come to develop some concerns with. And one is that, and I have it right here. I don't leave home without it, the org chart. And so, I look at it and I see, there's like this divide right down the middle. And, I recall in a lot of the briefings, there was a lot of discussion about USAID's core competencies being, disaster assistance and response. And I don't know if I agree with that. I think that a lot of it is capacity building and development, doing development. That's in the name of the agency. And so you see what you've almost got is creating sort of almost an international FEMA type model to the left. And then you've got a Bureau for Development within the development agency. That just strikes me as being a little odd. And so we've asked these questions about, about what is behind this structure and what is the future of USAID given the emphasis that's being placed on responding to crises. I would also note that structural change and setting goals like the journey to self-reliance, having goals, making structural change is not a replacement for policy and strategy. And when we've asked about how some of this is going to work, what is the policy, what is the strategy behind it, we're often told in these briefings that there's software issues that will be worked out. And that doesn't provide a whole lot of confidence in terms of what is really being thought through and in how this is going to be strategically implemented. Because I think that on paper, that you can look at this and you can make your own mind about what you think. And that that reorganization is something that certainly the administrator has his own purview to do. You've seen nearly every administration kind of has their own vision for how they want to see their bureaus and agencies work. departments and bureaus work. So I can't fault them for that, but I do have this feeling that there is kind of a change that's happening or that's being proposed here that I don't know if we totally understand yet. And
Josh, you mentioned some of the implementation soft side, and part of that are the process changes. And Mark Green's conversation has moved from graduating countries to a transition to now they're talking about the path to self-reliance.
Yeah.
And how is that being viewed? What does that be viewed as?
Yeah, so I think that, I don't think that there's any, his common, the thing that he likes to say is, the mission of development should be the need for development. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. We can't be in a perpetual state of donor-donee to a country. There has to be a goal to get that country to a point where they are not just a recipient of foreign aid, but are a partner and ally. That no one would disagree with that. And I think that developing processes for that, like the Strategic Transitions Initiative, is a process. And that is another thing that, that I have to give a lot of credit to USAID in terms of their engagement in discussing that, having ACFA involved in that, developing that process on, developing the metrics and the principles and the leave behind the legacy of that program. Joan was involved with that. I was involved with it. We were invited to be observers on that. I can't express enough appreciation for their, for seeking the inputs from stakeholders and from Congress on that. But I still think that at the end of the day, though, that is a process. It's not a policy, and it's not necessarily a strategy either. And that is what I am waiting for to see are the policies that are going to be guiding these changes that justify the change in the structure.
Mm-hmm. Jim?
I just haven't seen it yet.
I guess I don't understand the difference between what you're saying, the strategy and the policy need to really be kind of.
Well, because one is, I'm looking at a process versus like what policy will guide that process. What's behind that? That's what I have a hard time seeing. I haven't seen it yet.
Joan, resolve this.
Well, you're both right. Next question. I think sometimes you just have to get the dialogue right, and you have to start somewhere. So I think with the administrator bringing renewed focus to the need to have an ultimate objective of our programs is important. I think for a time we lost focus as a community, that the ultimate objective is to build the capacity of individuals to meet their own needs over time, and that this is not intended to be indefinite. And so we've been talking about graduation for a long time. I regret the use of the word has been interpreted to mean that we finish a program and that's it and there's no further engagement, end of story, because that was never my intent when I talked about graduation. But through these conversations, I have learned that that was how it was being interpreted. So using the term journey to self-reliance, I think is something that makes people feel a little more comfortable, that we're talking about, yes, we want people to be able to provide for themselves, and we want people to be able to realize their own hopes and ambitions and be able to feed their families and participate fully in the economy and in their governments if they choose to. That's a good thing. And it's also good to get all of our implementing partners and other donors starting to focus on that in a more wholesome manner as well. And so I think you have to start somewhere, and at least getting the terminology correct is a good place. Now, yes, there's still a lot to be seen on what that's going to look like, and that's why they're spending months and months and months and months building these different matrices so we can establish goals and objectives and then measure our progress toward meeting them. I have some confidence that there's been a level of seriousness put into these goals and objectives in the matrix to measure progress, that we will see results, but we're not going to see it in a report to the Hill saying this is what we're going to do. And they warned us about that. When they presented the org chart, they said, this is an org chart. We don't even want to give it to you because you're going to stop talking to us about all of the different policies, you're going to focus on the org chart. But you're making us give it to you, so here it is. And they're right. Their worst fears came true. Now we're focused only on an org chart and not about everything that led up to that org chart. But I do think that, yes, we need to do significant oversight and make sure that the goals and the policies and the strategies align behind what we've seen on paper and that the org chart is justified by it. But I think we're on a good path.
Good. Jim?
Really, I'd add to that this kind of just, and building off of what Josh was saying, that he's not totally convinced that the policies and strategy are there to implement what would be the kind of the journey to self-reliance. But I think that statement's the important part, the journey to self-reliance. We now have a stated goal, and everything else will fill in behind that. It kind of, I just am hearing kind of Kennedy's voice, we're going to the moon by the end of this decade. We are going to get on this journey to self-reliance, and we're gonna help out these folks. And now everyone can come together, and we now have one focus. So I think it's an important first step that has been made.
Can I add one more thing? Please. So, and Congress has been engaged on this journey to self-reliance before it was sexy to call it that. You need a couple of core things in order to develop and realize your full potential. You need access to food, to water, to energy, to markets, to opportunity, and you need to be able to participate in your government. You need to have someone looking out for your interests. And so both in the House and in the Senate, the pieces of legislation that we have moved have sought to advance all of those things. We did the Water for the World Act, water. We've done Global Food Security Act, food. We've done Power Africa, power. We've done the AGOA and AGOA MCC Modernization Act, markets. And we're constantly trying to ensure that governments are responding to the needs of their people and to demonstrate the need for them to take responsibility first and foremost, with assistance from other donors in the United States when and where appropriate. And so that's what I think our role has been in this journey to self-reliance, and it's something that I think that we should continue to focus on and continue to support the administration. And if they start running astray, we'll bring them back, because that's what Congress does.
Makes it sound like the Congress has had a strategy. This is impressive.
Almost, yes.
Josh?
Well, I see, the other side of, like, again, I don't, I think that the idea of the journey to self-reliance is something that is everyone should get behind, and it's not, as Joan was saying, it's not a totally new concept. But what I also have a hard time reconciling or understanding, and this again gets to like policy and strategy, is when you talk about the journey to self-reliance, and then you see proposed budgets that cut all foreign assistance to 32 countries in FY18 and then 24 in FY19. Where's the strategic transition for those countries? And so it just kind of, it adds this contradiction to a proposal that's being put forward, or causes me to question the sincerity of the proposal. I think it's, like I said, I think it's the right thing to do. I've been a part of the process. I've seen, and I agree that the process that is being laid forward in terms of evaluation is totally appropriate and necessary. But what is it actually informing, or how it will be used, is still something that's to be determined. And if FY20, if we see the same sort of cuts, or it makes me wonder, like, what is this process leading to if we keep saying the same thing in the Function 150 accounts?
One last quick question from me, 1 minute apiece, while the SID members decide what they want to pepper you with. Fragility. I think many people in the development community think fragility is the real challenge to development today, and I'm curious as to how the Congress is looking at it. And I know a few weeks ago, Cameron was at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee presenting the report from his commission, and did that help galvanize people, and where do you think the committee is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there is, what I think there is a strong focus on in the committee, and a lot of the challenges behind fragility and stabilization of countries is in the, managing crises space, which under this new AID, there's a big focus on. But I think that, that a lot of it gets, we talked about earlier, the defunding or the proposed, or not defunding, but like cuts in funding to democracy and DACA programs is concerning. But, Congress will come in and save the day on that, or that's the presumption anyway. And I think that the more engagement that happens on addressing fragility through, not just through stabilization of democracy, but also looking at resilience in agriculture, resilience in natural resource use and conservation, is a focus that can't go away, that needs to be maintained. It's hard to totally make that out with the budget proposals that we've seen and how that would work, but that is something that I think Congress will continue to address through the appropriations process by and large, and that that there are that through things like food aid reform and reauthorizing the Global Food Security Act, if we can get it done for 5 years, that will do a ton to help improve food security, which is a major destabilizing factor too. So I think that I think that there is an element to the legislation that you're seeing moving in Congress, even though it doesn't say right up front that there is that part of that mission may be to develop or to address fragility and stability. There certainly is a component to that, or it certainly will help address those issues.
For kind of the fragile states, everything that what my boss and I have seen really are what we've been doing is crisis management, it appears. We're moving from one famine to another famine to another. There's a crisis over here, there's a crisis over there. And what we're trying to do, at least through the BUILD Act and through everything else that we're doing, is start building up the kind of capacity development so that we are now making them hardened against potential crises. And we're also kind of not just, because it's more expensive to respond to a crisis than it is to actually invest with the country into building up their capacities to kind of be a bulwark against these impending crises, I guess.
Great. Feel free to start to make your way to the standing mics as Joan wraps up this conversation, which she'll do when she finishes making notes.
Well, I think the one thing that we haven't touched on is that the Department of Defense is the behemoth in the room and has taken on an increasingly important role in stabilization and fragility, for better or worse. I mean, our military is really, really good at warfighting. There's none better. But a bit more challenged when it comes to addressing the root causes of instability. And it's not a mission that DoD has expressed an interest in really taking on. And so we need to ensure that the State Department and USAID are more fully equipped and have the tools and the resources to address these causes of insecurity and instability, so we can mitigate the need for our warfighters to deploy in the first place. And so I think that on the Hill, there is a recognition of that, and that's why you're starting to see, in terms of rescissions and in terms of budgeting, you're starting to see more focus on parity, or at least a discussion of the need for greater parity for defense and non-defense national security funding and resources. It's never going to be equal, but at least the conversation is starting that we need to make sure that all 3 Ds are looked after. And there is some legislation that's pending that hopes to create a strategy so we can start to think more fully about these challenges. I am encouraged that the nominee for DACA is from SASC, and so I think it shows a level of seriousness on the part of USAID that they understand they need to have a better relationship and better communication and understanding of how DoD works, because DoD is playing an increasing role in a lot of humanitarian operations, including in the Ebola response, and they're going to continue to do so. And so I think it's a huge challenge. We don't really know what to do yet, but we know we have to address it, and that's where you all come in, and I'm sure you all have the answers, so I'm looking forward to learning them.
All right, it's time for you. The microphones are there. We're not sure anybody's out there because of the lights, but please. Oh, yes, ma'am, and please introduce yourself.
I'm Joan Galloso, USAID State and Peace Corps, and I just have two questions, and I apologize actually for asking them. This afternoon we heard a lot about national security, and in this panel we've heard a lot about fragility and stabilization. We've focused mostly on official development assistance from USAID. When you talk about budgets creating instability in some countries, do you think about the instability that will be created by sending back the temporary protected status people in this country, which will stabilize a number of Central American countries? My second question is unrelated, and it has to do with where do you see the multilateral organizations fitting in the overall process of U.S. aid going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I mean, I think that, you know, on the question of TPS, you know, I can say that from Senator Menendez's standpoint, you know, that is a tremendous issue that he has called on the administration to reevaluate its decision on sending back or canceling TPS status for Central America or for the Central American countries and Haiti, because you're absolutely right. The reports that have come back from the missions in those countries is that they simply cannot absorb that many people coming back, and that we are going to do our best to try to continue to highlight that issue, that we are contributing, that doing so would likely contribute to a further destabilization. You're absolutely right. On the point about, what was
Multilaterals.
Multilaterals. Thank you. I think that multilateral organizations tend to get a bad rap, I think, on the Hill, and that I think that there is an effort, there is legislation to have them reviewed, the Multilateral Assistance Review Act, which I think if done objectively could hopefully provide some better confidence on their value. On a bipartisan basis, but you know, I have my concerns about whether or not they would be done completely objectively and not have politics sort of color how that evaluation is done. But I think that process would hopefully shed some light on their and would reveal their value. But that is something that Congress has looked at.
And I think Congressman Yoho's BUILD Act, one of the major parts of it is giving it equity authority so it can work with multilaterals in making a greater impact with less money, essentially.
On the multilaterals, I think one of the challenges is we like to know exactly what we're spending our money on and where it's going, and there's historically been a challenge in terms of transparency on the part of some multilaterals, not all multilaterals are created equally. That's improving, largely from the work of Publish What You Fund and other transparency initiatives. So I think while we will never get to a position where American taxpayers want to send all of our foreign assistance through multilaterals just because We want to make sure that our assistance reflects our values and interests. I think that there is an opportunity to more fully leverage what the multilaterals are able to do and make sure that we're working in a coordinated fashion together. And I do understand that a lot of folks are panicked within budget requests that the multilaterals do tend to get undercut in the requests, but they do tend to also make out pretty well when appropriations come through, particularly the UN. In TPS, I don't cover that, so I'm not going to opine on it other than to say that, T does mean temporary, and so I think we have to figure out a way to make sure that we have the right tool available for these longer term challenges while not relying on something that is actually meant to be temporary. So perhaps there's a different tool that we should be looking for.
Hi, Jeff Grieco. I'm the Deputy Chair of SID and the President and CEO of the Afghanistan American Chamber of Commerce. I have 3 quick ones, and I leave it open for who would like to answer these. First question is on the reforms themselves. How do you see Congress helping the administration to operationalize the reforms? Are we going to do an authorization bill? Is this going to be embedded into the conference report of the next appropriations bill like we did with MCC when we first got it going?
Sounds like you did legislation one time.
Yeah, had a former job, yes. Number 2, tools. So in our morning sessions, we've talked a lot about stabilization. 70% of our assistance is now going to conflict, fragile, and failed states, which is why we're so focused now on this. So in all the discussions we have in this room and in this building, the people who have the skills to take those on. But the problem we've had is we've been using 20-year-old tools, 30-year-old tools to deal with these new problems. I think the development credit legislation is directly trying to address a new tool approach maybe to that. But I'm wondering, how much does Congress really talk about the tools? It's not just about the appropriations and how much we're spending. It's whether the tools those monies are going to support are effectuating the improvement of our national security and the host country's own development and stabilization. So how much do you think about tools, and what's your thinking? My last issue, on the Afghan side, the number one issue we've had to deal with is that we haven't been able to use the word capital for a long time. Capital is the grease that gets economies going. Access to capital in the Afghanistan area is the biggest impediment. And both women owners of businesses and men owners of businesses tell us that access to capital for them is the number one issue. It's not the issue of whether they have the technical capability to do the business. They have business plans. A lot of them have invested their own money up to tens of millions of dollars in different types of industry investments. But getting further access to grow and scale those so they can hire more people and stabilize communities, that's their biggest problem. How much do you guys think about that too?
All right, let's take the first question first. And just to frame it, my understanding from AID that the only legislative action that's necessary is an additional presidential appointment, plus considering all the CNs that will be set up. Joan?
And that's what we've been told as well. I mean, we've consistently asked, and I've been actually rather enthusiastic to try to do a bill to authorize all this. But we've been told consistently, we'll come to you when we need authority. We think that we've got what we need. There was a lot of talk about an authorization bill when everyone was in a panic about USAID being absorbed into the State Department. But that has now passed, and so there's not a need to do that. But yeah, if there's a need identified for authorization, I think we would very much want to respond. In terms of stabilization authorities, the same thing. We just got briefed on a stabilization strategy, and within the same week we got briefed on a request from DoD for some authorities relating to stabilization and their relationship to USAID, and we've asked, are there authorities that are required, or is there anything that you need? On the DoD front, there is. On the USAID front, it's not apparent that there is a needed authority just now, but if there is, by all means, we need folks to articulate that and let us know quick, because we're barreling toward the end of the year here, and the opportunity to actually get something done is closing. On Afghanistan, access to capital, access to capital is typically the greatest impediment to growth in many contexts, Afghanistan included. And so we've been trying to figure out ways to expand access, and the BUILD Act is one of those ways. But we do a lot of microcredit, but that's never going to help people get from the lowest level of economic activity to a small medium enterprise. So I think we do need some additional tools, and we actually had a hearing on it in our committee, particularly focused on women, and I think there's still a lot of interest and discussion in trying to figure out what is needed and how we can best expand access to capital. Afghanistan's tough because there's been sanctions historically, and some of the reticence in terms of engagement in the banking sector, as I understand it, and I'm not an Afghanistan expert, but from my sanctions person telling me, is that there's a fear of over-enforcement of the sanctions legislation more than actual impediments. But I leave it to the experts to tell me if that's correct.
So on the reform legislation question, I think it's right that in terms of, well, it depends on what reforms we're talking about. If we're talking about the structure of USAID, I think that's correct. I don't think there is any need for any legislation to do that. I think that every administration kind of has their own authority to do what they want in terms of how they structure an organization. On the policy side, or on the process side, or wherever you want to characterize the Strategic Transitions Initiative, it's not clear to me as to whether or not there is a need for legislation to do it. Probably not, but I think that legislation might help build confidence for it, and it would also just sort of, I think, if we were able to put some guardrails perhaps on the process and add some policy to this framework that we've seen, is something that might be worth considering. I've certainly thought about it. I just don't have a whole lot of time to do much drafting these days. But another issue that, in terms of legislative reform, something that we've seen in both the FY18 and FY19 budget that has raised my eyebrows 2 years in a row, is the consolidation of the Economic Support Fund, the Development Assistance Fund, or the Development Assistance Fund, and a few other smaller, more regional development programs into this new Economic Support and Development Fund that I have seen no legislative proposal on from this administration, describing what that is, absent or except for maybe the 2 or 3 sentences in the budget that describe exactly what it is, or describe what it is in very broad terms. I would like to think that if the intention is real to create this new amorphous development fund, that we would see a legislative proposal from the administration on what that is. But we've already seen 2 budgets where they've called out this program but provided nothing. So again, I don't know how serious that proposal is, because it's not something that Congress has taken up. We certainly haven't authorized it through the appropriations process. But that is something that I would like to think that if there was a desire to actually create that the administration would submit legislation on that. On the access to capital side in Afghanistan, looking at the BUILD Act, something that Senator Menendez is, or at least we're recommending Senator Menendez do in our process, is because we are working to ensure the development mandate of this new entity is very clear, and we think that one of the points to make in it would be to preserve the positive subsidy investments within that exist at OPIC, have that carry forward, because if the new International Development Finance Corporation is too centered on risk, you're never going to see investment through a new agency like this in places like Afghanistan without a positive subsidy. So that is something that we are looking to put into the bill in the Senate process. And you know, there is the Frankel Amendment that was adopted in the House process that did, I don't have it committed totally to memory, but I believe it did deal specifically with women's economic empowerment, that should hopefully address some of that issues. And you combine that with an amendment on positive subsidy, I'm hopeful we're pushing the right buttons there anyway. So.
Okay. Anybody else? One last question I have for you all is, you've got here a lot of individuals and organizations who spend some time communicating with the Congress in support of development. And when I say development, I mean writ large: humanitarian, regular development, stabilization, political. What is it that Congress needs to hear? What do you need? What do you need your bosses to hear, both on a factual level and the best way to frame the importance of development? Josh?
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, I think success stories on how development efforts are addressing extreme poverty, making people's lives better, healthier, making countries more stable, and getting countries on that journey to self-reliance. I mean, I think that that is what we need to know. I also think that understanding, you know, as Jim was saying, you know, how constituencies back home, how relating this back to New Jersey for my boss. I mean, he's very, you know, I mean, he knows a lot of the players already because he's been doing this for a long time. But I still think that understanding or presenting this broader picture to senators, to members of Congress about how, you know, not just from a business standpoint, but like, I think that, you know, I look at New Jersey or my former bosses, you know, Maryland, the diaspora of you know, of our immigrant communities in New Jersey and Maryland and all over this country, and understanding how their families or extended families and you know, the places that they come from are being helped and affected, and engaging those communities in discussions about development, I think is very valuable, and really sends the message home that this is that these are communities that care about, not just from a standpoint of like the business interest or you know, and a U.S. strategic interest, but that these are that there are that America's roots are in these countries that we're helping. I think that is also very valuable.
I think too often folks will come up to the Hill and focus on the macro of everything. And again, just to reiterate, bring it home, especially when you're talking to representatives. They want to know how it's impacting their district, their state. You have to just really bring it home. And I mean, it's great to talk about the lofty goals and really what we're doing, but honestly, you need to bring it home for each and every one of them. A lot of people when we first started on this path with Build, they were asking, okay, what's the most effective way that we can engage with Freedom Caucus members, with far-right members? And in addition to talking about how it's impacting the state, how it's impacting the locale, how it's impacting their districts, you also want to talk about how it's saving money on the long end. You want to talk about how this is an investment, how in the long term we will see returns on these investments. And you want to really just, I can't say it enough. You have to really just let them focus, so when they go home to their district, they're saying, I'm bringing research to the University of Florida on agriculture, at IFAS. IFAS is getting money for that research because there's a grant from USAID. That's important for not only the researchers at IFAS, but also the farmers that it's going to benefit downstream. I mean, NASA picked this up a long time ago when they said that look at all these great inventions, from sending all these folks up into low orbits. We've got now CAT scans, camera phones, memory foam mattresses. The list goes on from all of this. So what are the benefits for us engaging over in a country that most of my constituents will never, ever visit? So what is that? That's really, I think, what you should be doing.
So, slightly different answer, and at risk of being thrown out of the room. One thing that I would caution about is that the biggest impediment to effective foreign assistance is the dreaded directive. And I do understand that we need to build a constituency for foreign assistance, and a way to do that is to build support for your specific sector-focused activity. And that's good, but when members are repeatedly asked to provide a funding directive for a specific sector, that takes away from efficiency, it takes away from discretion, and the ability to adapt to changing needs on the ground. And so that is a real challenge, trying to strike that balance between building the constituency and not over-directing our resources in a matter where you end up, like Egypt, for example, where you have a $350 million budget, $17,000 of which is discretionary. The rest is earmarked. That's a problem, particularly when you have a change in government that might not have been expected. And then you have no ability to change how you operate on the ground. So I would ask for some discipline in terms of funding directives, but my colleagues are absolutely correct. When you're talking to members, make it personal. If you can bring it back to the district, great. If you can't bring it back to the district, that's okay too. Just make it personal. Put a personal face on it. If a member has not supported something that you think they should support, maybe just ask them why. Maybe they don't know about the program. Maybe they're just taking a vote because they've taken 30 votes that day and they have no idea what it was about. So actually take the time to talk to them and explain what you think this program does and why it's important and what it delivers. And actually see how members vote. You might find a pattern, and maybe there's a way to then figure out how to change that pattern. Maybe call up the head of a local college or university and see if, have you talked to this member about how important this program is? Maybe you should do that. Work in concentric circles and just support each other. When groups come in and undercut each other, that does a disservice to the 150 account. And so I hate to be up here and sing Kumbaya, but if we can all get on the same page about why it's important and focusing on the ultimate desire to and the need for foreign assistance, I think we can make a lot of progress.
Joan, that was a very nice, balanced, understated explanation of the problem with directives. I congratulate you for that. Before I thank the panelists, I'm sure Catherine would want me to encourage everybody to continue networking over a drink out in the lobby. And in thanking the panelists, let me say that these three senior congressional staff represent a cadre of individuals who work every day on what we care about. And I think in this time of high partisanship, a Congress that we love to rail about being so dysfunctional actually happens to be the node of stability and sustainability for development and for foreign assistance. So please join me in thanking the panelists for being here and for what they do.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you to George, and thank you very much to our panelists. We do have cocktails across the hall, and we're very much hoping that you'll stay here with us for a few more minutes to enjoy those and socialize and talk a little bit more with all the colleagues here in the room that are excited to continue this discussion. I want to thank all of you for staying here throughout the whole entire day and for your active engagement throughout this day. As we talked about this morning, this year we brought in new and different perspectives from experts across a variety of fields in defense and security, technology, commerce, and diplomacy. Responding to the feedback you gave to us, you asked us to elevate the topics for this conference above just the practitioner level that we discuss all the time in our work groups and really bring it up to a policy and macro level. So we hope that you got something out of that. We've done all of this within the context of a rapidly changing world and the need that we all have to look at the future of development. And what we've heard is that how we advance development as a passion and as a profession has changed a lot over the past decade, and this change is going to accelerate in the years to come. If I had to summarize what I heard today about the past, the present, and the future, I learned that we've got some discrepancies that we still need to reconcile, and I'll encourage all of you to continue to talk about them as we go into the reception. We heard about a focus on outputs and a focus on outcomes. We heard about development assistance, and then we heard about FDI and local government financing. We heard about natural disasters, man-made disasters. We heard about permissive environments and non-permissive environments, poverty and inequity, lessons learned and lessons encountered, countries in conflict, countries in reoccurring conflict, doing good, delivering value, direct assistance, catalytic investment, project outputs, mission outcomes, state actors, non-state actors, siloed strategies, and close collaboration, collective action, and consolidated programs. So I hope that all of you can continue to talk about how we look forward into the future as development professionals, policymakers, and practitioners, and how we will shape a positive global future for all of those with whom we serve. So with that, thank you again for coming today. Catherine has a couple announcements that I would like to make. First is that the reception is directly across the hall in the rooms where we had our breakout panels. And second is that for those of you who downloaded the app and put your name in for the raffle, apparently there were lots and lots of people that did that, and she's going to announce the winner of the raffle across the room. So thank you all once again, and thanks to Sue, Catherine, and the SID Washington team for an extraordinary conference.